Good morning and welcome to Focus on the Bible. I am so glad that you are listening. I want to begin by inviting you to our services at Eastside. Meet at 9 o'clock for worship, followed by Bible classes for all ages at 9:30, and then at 10:30 for a second period of worship. In addition, we meet at 6 on Wednesday evenings for Bible study. We'd love to have you come and visit with us soon. Right now, though, I do want us to begin in Matthew chapter 7. Matthew 7, verse 24. Matthew 7 and verse 24. There Jesus says, near the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 7 verse 24, Jesus says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it." I want to show you a picture this morning. I want to ask you if you recognize this bridge. I told Michael before I left the house this morning, since Laura's not feeling well and Tammy's staying home with the kids, I said I'll be showing a picture of a bridge in the PowerPoint this morning. See if you can tell me about it when I come back. So maybe he's paying attention to this. Do you recognize this bridge? It's probably one of the most famous bridges in all of the United States. Of course, the Golden Gate Bridge. Every day, thousands of people drive across that bridge going into San Francisco or coming out of San Francisco. And lots of tourists stand on that officially designated place and have their pictures made in front of the Golden Gate Bridge. I like what this lady did. I wonder how long it took for them to set up that picture just right where she's leaning on the bridge. Very, very, very cool. I wonder, all the people driving on it and all the people having their pictures made in front of it, I wonder how many folks thought about how exactly that bridge is standing up. I mean, how exactly did they build that bridge? How did the engineers figure out how to do that in such a way that it's standing? You should know that that bridge was completed in 1937. 1937 technology is what we're talking about here. That means that this bridge has stood for over 70 years. And one of the most treacherous stretches of harbor and ocean anywhere in the world. The narrow strait known as the Golden Gate is only a little more than a mile wide, but every second 2.3 million cubic feet of water flow through that strait. Fresh water trying to go to the ocean, salt water from the ocean trying to come into the harbor, and that kind of creates these tidal currents so they make incredible forces and eddies and all kinds of rip tides that pull things apart. Now on top of that, there's a lot of wind in San Francisco. And the loft of that bridge, and the loft at the bridge piers, the wind is right at 60 miles an hour almost all the time. Can you imagine that? 60 miles an hour all the time. And, I don't know, you may know this about California. It's one of the lesser known facts about the state. California occasionally gets earthquakes. Those giant seismic shifts where the earth rolls and heaves. And despite all of that, fog and salt in the air that tarnishes and rusts away, ships getting lost that ram into the Golden Gate Bridge in the dark, those tremendous earthquakes and every kind of storm, the Golden Gate Bridge has stood since 1937. It's amazing. It's more than likely, Lord willing, in our lifetime, we'll see that it has stood for 100 years. Well, what's the secret to that? Well, the secret to that, the big engineering feat here, is those two piers. They're sunk deep down into the bedrock. The closer pier that you're looking at here is in fact dug down 100 feet below the surface, and then 35 feet further down into solid bedrock. The southern pier is dug just as deeply down into the bedrock as well, despite the fact that it stands in the middle of the harbor. And that required some real engineering to box out the ocean and be able to dig it down. But the engineers knew that if the bridge was going to stand there with those currents and those winds and the tides and those kinds of obstacles and earthquakes, if you're going to stand the bridge right there, you got to build it on a rock. Which brings us to what Jesus says in Matthew 7. Jesus talks about building on a rock. And that is what I'm going to say to you repeatedly this morning in every way that I possibly can, is that what you are building on in your life, it has to be the rock. And if you're not building on the rock, then what you're building will not stand. Now that's particularly, this particular parable that Jesus tells here is really not overly complicated or difficult to understand. There are some times in some of the parables Jesus says that it's harder to dissect what Jesus is going through there and what he's demonstrating for us. But really, there's no hidden message here at all. It's something that we can all understand and apply to our lives very, very well. Jesus talks about standing on the rock. Now, let me ask this though. Well, what does that mean for us though? It's not hard to understand what it means to build on the rock, but what does that really mean for us? And in order to understand that, you should know that this is an image that's borrowed from the Old Testament here, if you could. It reminds us of some of the things that was said in the Old Testament. Jesus, I would say, did that on purpose for that audience of his, the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 32, here, there it is. In Deuteronomy 32, I'll remind you again that Jesus is talking to people who are just steeped in Old Testament. And when he uses this kind of imagery, you can count on these people thinking about and understanding about what he's talking about. Like, wait a minute, this reminds me of what Moses wrote. So who is the rock? The metaphor often employed in the Old Testament to talk about God is this metaphor. Look in Deuteronomy 32 verse 4. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. In fact, that term occurs again in verse 15. Verse 15, he scoffed at the rock of his salvation. Now verse 18, you are unmindful of the rock that you bore. There it is, sorry, there you go. You are unmindful of the rock that you bore, and you forgot the God who gave you birth. One more time here. In verse 31, Moses again uses that imagery here. For their rock is not as our rock. Our enemies are by themselves. I wonder when Jesus is talking about rock, if he's not pressing his audience to think a little bit beyond just literal rocks. To think about what they commonly thought of as the rock. Is Jesus talking about building on God? Now, as you work with this sermon, as you work with this parable here, that seems very likely. Let me step aside that for just a moment and talk a little bit about what it is to build on the rock. When I was a kid, we lived in South Florida, Sarasota, Venice area of Florida, and we went down to the beach all the time. I loved going to the beach. Christmas Day, after we opened up our gifts, we'd go down to the beach. My brother and I especially loved going to Venice Beach. There was a jetty there that we loved to play on. There was a picture of that jetty. It was great, right? Huge rocks, deep crevices. We'd climb all over them, play hide and seek, find little crabs in the little pools made by the low tide. We were in Sunday school one morning, and the teacher talked about the wise man built his house on the rock and the foolish man on the sand. My first thought was, how are you going to build a house on rocks? I mean, it'd be all whopper-jawed and leaning and not very sturdy. And he should have built somewhere flat, like maybe that sandy beach down there. That's where he ought to have built that house. But of course, Jesus isn't talking about building on a rumble of jetty rocks. That's not what he means at all. What's it mean then to build on the rock? In fact, somebody's thinking, well, why don't we build on rock? Actually, we do. We do build on rock. When you get ready to build a house, what do? You call the contractor out, and they put down foundation forms, and they pour that huge slab of concrete. Unless maybe you have a crawl space or basement. That's a little different. But in some way, even to this day, you get some sort of slab down, some sort of thing that ties the house down to something that won't move. And that's what building on the rock is all about. If you are building a house in Jesus' day, in the New Testament, you're not pouring a concrete foundation in that day and time. What you'll be doing is digging down into the bedrock and attaching your home to the rock, to a foundation that isn't going anywhere, and you want to fix your house to something permanent. Now, let me say a word or two about the storm business. the rains fell and the floods came. What Jesus is talking about here is one of the most dangerous phenomena in weather. He's talking about a flash flood. You know about flash floods? How many public service announcements do we have that talk about don't drive in water, right? Turn around, don't drown. That's the public service announcement. Why that signage? Why do you have that? Because it's inevitable. What happens as soon as a flash flood occurs is somebody drives into the water and then drowns. Why? Because, and they're saying this as their car is being swept away, I've driven over this creek 100 times. I don't have anything to worry about. Every year in bus certification training, they show us videos of things of drivers that made bad and poor decisions. They showed us a video last time that I was at this training of a bus driver in Texas who came across a place in the road where he had to drive across a creek, and the creek was a little too high. He thought it was okay. He's in a big 13-ton bus. He'd be fine. And as soon as he plowed into the water, that current swept him away. And, of course, the dash cam of the bus, we got to watch him gliding down that creek. Fortunately, he didn't have any kids on the bus. He was going back home. So it was just him, and they were able to rescue him. But that was a scary drive for him. But he was confident. Hey, this big, heavy bus, that creek can't stand a chance. And yet he didn't know what he was talking about. So we understand about flash floods and the dangerous power that water has. And Jesus talks about that. Jesus talks about the dangers of those flash floods. He talks about somebody who builds a house by a babbling brook, which seems like a great idea because then you're close to a water source, can get fresh water easily and quickly when the rains begin. And that babbling brook swells and it begins to run faster and faster, and now it's a swollen creek. And it doesn't stop raining, and now it's out of its banks. This thing that used to be a babbling brook is now a raging river, and it keeps getting higher and higher, and then it sweeps everything away. That's what Jesus is talking about. Everything that isn't tied down is going to be absolutely lost. And that's a great image, by the way, for the story. Because a number of times in the Old Testament, the imagery of flooding is used to talk about the wrath of God, about God's judgment. So Jesus here is probably without any doubt speaking of the final test, the day of judgment. But even in some ways, I think he's talking about the day-to-day storms of everyday life that can just sweep you away if you're not affixed to something absolutely permanent.
Join us next week for the continuation of this lesson. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great and wonderful day.